So I want to now turn it over to Dr. Commissaris. Dr. Commissaris is going to talk to you about a little bit about the proposal and some of the work that he's doing. But just to give you a little background, we'll set the stage where he's coming from. He received his PhD in pharmacology and toxicology in 1981 at Michigan State University. After completing his PhD, he was a postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Psychiatry at Yale University, and he worked under the mentorship of Dr. Michael Davis. He joined the Department of Pharmaceutical Sciences at Wayne State in 1983, and he's continued to teach and do research on pharmacology and toxicology of drugs of abuse and drugs used in psychiatry. In 1984, he established an elective course in special topics of drug abuse for the pharmacy program, and it has been a favorite among our students and is still being offered to this day. Over the years, he's been the recipient of many teaching awards. He's been identified as the Teacher of the Year by our pharmacy students. In March, he was recognized as a Wayne State University President's Award for Teaching. He's published over 80 peer-reviewed articles, numerous reviews, book chapters, most of which have been published with Wayne State students as co-authors. He's received grant support from numerous federal agencies and private companies. About 5 years ago, he kind of changed the direction of his research. He went from testing rats in mazes and operant scanner boxes to testing humans in a driving simulator. And in 2013, in collaboration with Dr. Doreen Head, who is in occupational therapy at the college, they initiated a program of studies related to driving and distracted driving. This collaboration has been very fruitful. They had a 2015 paper entitled Age Differences and Effects of Texting and Driving Performance in a Driving Simulator, was published in a very high-impact journal in the field, Accident Analysis and Prevention, and it was noted as one of the top 10 publications downloaded from that journal for the year. Recently, he's been studying the effects of marijuana on driving and distracted driving, and this is one of the topics, like I mentioned, of his talk today. So Dr. Commissaris will also provide a brief overview of the Michigan Marijuana Legislation Initiative, and so I will turn it over to him.
Thank you, Christine. Our other guest speaker has arrived, so I would invite Dr. Sabet, please come sit at the big table. It's unfortunate that someone has to come late, but he had an important meeting regarding today's topic. So I think we have one of the right people, and we've got a good panel for today. Thank you, Christine, for the introduction. I'm going to talk about two things today. I'll talk briefly about the Legalization initiative itself. I'll try to compare and contrast it to some other legalization initiatives in other states, and so you can see sort of where Michigan stands in a sense. And then I'll talk a little bit about marijuana and driving, and not so much about my ongoing research, but more about what are some of the issues, and at one level we'll try to talk about how our research might try to tackle some of those issues. But if you want information about the actual initiative, Ballotopedia is actually a pretty good source. The full text of the initiative is on Ballotopedia. What's on the screen now is essentially what you will see when you walk into the voting booth. Do you favor that, yes or no? Here are some of the basics in more bullet form. Users must be 21 years old or older. It allows for personal cultivation and personal possession within limits. It does provide regulations for marijuana businesses and micro businesses. It includes THC-infused edibles. It also allows for the cultivation of hemp. It changes several penalties from what were previously criminal penalties, criminal infractions, to civil infractions. It will include an excise tax, and that money will be used to spend, will be targeted in particular ways, and it will not allow driving under the influence of marijuana. So that's sort of the initiative in a nutshell. Now we'll try to compare it with some others. I think everybody knows Michigan would not be the first state if they approve it. This is a map showing the 8 states that have approved. Washington, D.C. as a district has also approved. Washington State and Colorado were the first in 2012, and 6 other states have joined them. If it passes in Michigan, Michigan will be either number 9 or perhaps number 10, depending on whether it passes, and depends on what happens in North Dakota, which also has an initiative. Obviously, there's going to be revenue coming from this, and Michigan, the state of Michigan will tax the revenues and spend those revenues. The current proposal is for a 10% excise tax on the part of Michigan. This is, like I say, Michigan is proposing 10%. Other states have used different figures. Washington is still the highest state in terms of the excise tax. It was passed at 25%. That was increased to 37%. Massachusetts was the lowest at just a shade under 4%. As soon as it passed, the legislature jacked that up to about 10%. But at 10% excise tax, Michigan is going to be on the low end of the states that have legal marijuana if it passes. What will that do? How much money will that raise? It will raise just shy of $300 million a year. Lest you think that's a big number, if you win the Powerball, you get 5 times that much right now. So I'm not saying buy the Powerball ticket, but $300 million a year is a significant amount nonetheless. How will it be spent? And this is per the initiative. It'll be divided 3 ways. 35% will go to K-12 schools. 35% will go to roads and bridges. 30% will be divided between local governments, either counties or municipalities, getting 15% each. This portion is absolutely dependent upon allowing legal marijuana sales within that municipality. So if you elect not to have it in your district, you won't get those revenues. There's a much smaller portion that's going into implementation costs and a limited amount for clinical trials and some medical marijuana studies. So that's the initiative. Who supports it and who opposes it? At the governor's level, we have Gretchen Whitmer on the Democratic side supports it. Bill Schuette on the Republican side is personally opposed, but would, of course, support it if it's passed. And the Libertarian Bill Gelano is also in support. The press is a bit divided. The Detroit Free Press and Lansing State Journal, 2 of our larger papers, are both in support. The Detroit News is in the opposition. Public opinion polls generally favor this initiative. Polls will vary. This is a handful of polls. Probably the closest margin is about 3%, still passing, but by a 3% margin. Some of the widest margins, depending on the poll, are almost a 2-to-1 ratio, 60-30 roughly. So that's the initiative. The only other thing I would say is vote on November 6th. Now I'd like to talk a little bit about driving and marijuana and some of the issues and concerns. And it's a given that lots of marijuana use is already happening, and driving after marijuana use is already happening now. It will increase if this initiative passes, but it will still be there if this initiative fails. So we need to address this problem either way. I think there are 2 kind of extreme views, and I wouldn't advocate for either. One extreme view is sometimes people will say, I'm not even affected by pot. I drive better when I'm stoned. I think that's not true. I think there's no evidence for that, but people will say that. I think the other extreme is if you have any amount of marijuana in you, then you are guilty of driving under the influence of marijuana. And as Christine has pointed out in her talk, there's an evidence for a long-term persistence of marijuana at very low levels, likely not to be affecting driving. So those are the 2 extremes. How do we get to a more rational, evidence-based kind of a cutoff? And I'm going to propose, I'm going to present a few points. I'm going to use alcohol as a reference point because alcohol is a drug that's used recreationally and it also has significant driving impact. So I'm going to talk about really 5 issues: roadside tests for predicting blood concentrations, and what Christine has alluded to, which I'd call the persistence problem or marijuana pharmacokinetics. Another issue with marijuana is trying to predict brain concentrations from blood concentrations if you have them. Another issue is essentially road sobriety testing. And lastly, I'd like to finish with some ideas about using driving simulator studies to sort of try to come with effect-based thresholds. In terms of roadside analytical tests for measuring for drugs, everybody's probably familiar with the fact that breathalyzers exist. It's standard equipment in almost every police department car. It's a reliable instrument, a good predictor. It's not perfect, and so it will almost never show up in court, but it's a very good predictor, and officers use that as an indicator, and then that's later confirmed with some kind of a blood analysis. But the breathalyzer is a good instrument. Marijuana, some of you may be surprised, but actually there are some in-car marijuana detection devices being tried now, even in Michigan. 5 Michigan counties have state police cars that are equipped with in-car oral swab testing devices. This is an enzymatic assay. Again, it's not perfect, but it provides a pretty good indicator. And essentially, the saliva will correlate closely with the plasma concentration. Nonetheless, any legal action would always require some kind of confirmation from a blood test. But in all honesty, roadside tests for measuring measuring marijuana are actually not that far from being fairly commonplace and effective. One of the issues with marijuana, though, is, and Christine alluded to this related to its kinetics, is what I call the persistence problem. I'll use alcohol as a compare and contrast kind of drug. Alcohol pharmacokinetics is real easy. It's what's called zero-order kinetics. After someone consumes their alcohol, the concentration of alcohol falls as linearly as a function of time. And you can get almost to zero alcohol, and you can predict when that will happen. It's so good that experts are often asked to back calculate what would the alcohol concentration have been then if it had been 2 hours earlier, kind of a thing. It's a very linear and predictable function. This is a graph. I took this off the internet, but this is present in a lot of textbooks and stuff. Basically, you've got concentration of alcohol and time on the x-axis, and you can see it's a real linear function. There's not anything really complicated about the kinetics of alcohol in and of itself. On the other hand, marijuana is not easy peasy. Marijuana concentrations after a single joint, they maybe peak at about 100 to 150 nanograms per milliliter, and then they fall after that over about 30 to 45 minutes to an hour. But then, as Christine alluded to, there's this low-level, persisting amount of marijuana that you can measure in the blood, and that becomes a bit problematic. This is a classic. This is from Marilyn Hustis, who's a leading researcher in the field. And essentially, you can see after someone smoked marijuana, the concentration shoots up to about 150 nanograms per milliliter, drops very rapidly. And then there's this second phase, which is actually very prolonged. This scale is hours, but if it were days, you'd still see values above zero. Measurable, real concentrations of marijuana that you can see and measure, low that they are, you can see and measure them long after a couple of weeks. So why does this happen? Why is the marijuana unique? Well, it's that, as Christine said, THC, which is the active agent, is highly lipophilic, meaning it loves fat, and it literally hangs out in body fat and only slowly leaves the fat to go to the bloodstream and then be eliminated. So most of it hangs out in the fat and slowly leaves that area. With sophisticated instruments, you can measure marijuana concentrations in the blood for more than 3, sometimes 4 weeks after someone has stopped using. It's really, really there. So that's a bit of an issue. Let's talk about brain concentrations, because the reality is these drugs are working in the brain. We're not going to take a brain biopsy to determine if somebody's drunk or a stoned driver, but what we really want to know is how much is in your brain. Alcohol works by the brain. The blood alcohol concentration equilibrates, matches, balances out with the brain concentration quite readily, so that the blood alcohol concentration is a pretty good reflection of what's in the brain. Well, what about marijuana? Marijuana works, of course, by its actions in the brain. The concentration relationship between blood THC concentrations in brain has not very well been worked out. It's a bit of a concern because brain cells have their own fat. They have a thing called myelin, which is sort of their insulator sheath around neurons, around nerves, but essentially it's a very fatty kind of a material. And it stands to reason that THC would actually concentrate in the brain, perhaps at higher levels than in the blood. And that's exactly what's been shown, although the studies are very limited. Limited studies are basically shown that brain concentrations are about twice what they are in the blood. So we know that the blood-brain ratio for concentration differences is really important. Right now we sort of have a sense that it might be 2-to-1 kind of ratio, but that really needs to be worked out more clearly. The next thing I want to talk about is road sobriety tests. Essentially, field sobriety tests for alcohol have been around for a long time. They were tested initially at 0.1% alcohol. That's roughly 6 beers, I guess, for a normal-sized person. And then they were validated later at 0.08. 0.08% is sort of like 4 beers, if you will. And that's sort of the legal cutoff for intoxicated driving in every state except Utah, which is a little bit lower. So that's field sobriety tests and alcohol. What about THC and other drugs? Essentially now we get into an area called drug recognition experts. Essentially in almost all states they have officers now that have additional extensive testing to identify impairment by drugs other than alcohol. These officers are identified as drug recognition experts. They take additional training. The state police, I think probably at every post now has probably 1 DRE officer or maybe more. DRE officers use their training. They look for cues related to intoxication by substances other than alcohol. And they're actually quite good at identifying frank intoxication and picking out which drug might be the suspect drug. I think the biggest concern with drug recognition experts is one of sensitivity. Essentially, threshold levels. I mean, what is the minimum concentration that a DRE officer can identify as being the effect of marijuana or the effect of cocaine or the effect of any particular drug? It's harder to discern, but clearly in the case of frank intoxication, they're very effective. Last thing I want to talk about is trying to establish effect-based thresholds in a virtual reality kind of a setting, and that's using driving simulators. For those who don't know, a driving simulator is, at least at the highest level, it's a full-size car that doesn't go anywhere. It has a black box recorder, kind of like an airplane crash black box recorder has, so it collects lots of data from the car, steering, acceleration, braking, whatnot. And you project a video of a road and you drive on the road. And as you drive, the video changes, and you try to create different scenarios and try to keep up with the road kind of a thing. Essentially what it really does is it creates this archive of this drive in a digital kind of a way. And it's very high resolution in time because it collects data at 60 samples for every second. So then we can play that back later and analyze it. Our simulator is a 2001 Chevy Impala. There's somebody standing in front of it in the video screens, and here's a car full of teenagers that we had one day. In terms of work, simulator studies have contributed a lot to our understanding of alcohol. They've validated essentially the 0.08 as a real effect-based level where driving impairment really happens at that concentration. You can measure it, you can document it, you can map it back to real-world kind of problems. What about marijuana? I'll talk about 2 studies because really there's one really good published study and then some stuff that we're working on. Marilyn Hustis, said the name before, she's a marijuana toxicology expert. She's done a study, and what they did, this was a study in collaboration with folks at the University of Iowa. They have a national driving simulator lab there. She brought in experienced users and gave them marijuana or alcohol or placebo. She measured their driving, and in a lot of simulated driving, one of the primary measurements of your driving is getting kind of bad is weaving behavior, and that's called lateral movement. And what we look for is really what's called standard deviation of lane position. How much is the car moving back and forth in the lane over time? You probably see it on the freeway on the way here and back from work, and you'll see someone weaving back and forth, and you'll say, somebody's texting. Let's hope they're not drunk. But somebody's texting. Let's hope they're not texting too, but that's a very common measure of the impairing effects of texting on driving. So Marilyn Eustis measured this standard deviation of lane position. She also took blood samples and measured alcohol when they got alcohol. She measured marijuana when they got marijuana. And then what she did is she said, okay, if 0.08 is legally intoxicated, how bad is your weaving behavior there? And now let's turn the tables and say, when you're weaving that badly, how much THC do you have in you? To try to come up with a comparable level of THC that matches 0.08 alcohol. Her results were a little bit of a surprise for her. It's a kind of a busy graph that I tried to add a little bit to. The y-axis is the SDLP, that's this weaving behavior. X-axis on the top is your alcohol concentration, and that's the blue line. X-axis on the bottom is the THC concentration, that's the red line. So if you look at 0.08 alcohol, and you say, okay, we're going to go down to 0.08 alcohol, find the blue line. How much weaving do you have? It's roughly about 36.7 is your standard deviation of lane position. So that's how much weaving happens with borderline drunk. So how much weaving, so if you use that as your weaving measure, how much marijuana do you need to be a borderline drunk in the weaving procedure? Or to be a borderline stone driver, if you will. And that number turned out to be 13.2. So she published a paper, and her cutoff, not a cutoff really, her extrapolated value for marijuana that's comparable to alcohol in this test is 13.2 nanograms per milliliter. Now, different states have different cutoffs. Some states don't have a cutoff. The highest one that's used, Colorado, Washington State, Maine, a lot of the states that have medical marijuana also use this value, and that is 5 nanograms per milliliter. That's the highest. Some are lower. Nevada's 2 nanograms per milliliter. Canada is two-tiered, 2 nanograms per milliliter at one level for one level of punishment, if you will, and 5 nanograms per mil for a much more serious level of infraction. These numbers are all way lower than 13.2. So what gives? Marilyn Eustis herself, she was at a conference in Ann Arbor about 3 weeks ago, and she presented some of this data. And basically, I think she did a second thought about it. She said, I don't think that weaving in your lane is really the best way to measure the effects of THC on driving. And this is a quote from her at the meeting. The issue with cannabis is that you try to compensate and you do pretty well. But guess what the main problem is? It's when an unexpected event happens. That's where they can't compensate. So they're trying to do well, but now they hit a piece of black ice. A kid comes out on a bicycle, a deer runs out of the woods or whatever. Everything is slowed, and that's where you see the marijuana effect with these unexpected events. And so I thought I'd use her to promote some of our research, if you pardon me. So we're doing studies with the Applebaum simulator, and we have a paradigm that essentially taps into that. We were doing this before she came to the meeting and said such a lovely comment for us, but we'll still use her as a supporter. We call our program the Arctic. It's called Avoidance Reaction Time Involving Collisions. And our current study, we have 3 groups of subjects. We have control subjects. We have medical marijuana subjects who regularly use their marijuana but have abstained for some period of time, 8 to 12 hours. And we have regular medical marijuana users who have taken fairly recently. We don't provide it. They provide it themselves, and they provide a ride to the laboratory. Our primary measure is their reaction time to avoid a crash. So what we do is we have them drive down a straight road at 55 miles an hour, and this is really easy. And then all of a sudden we have a stalled car just appear out of nowhere in front of them. And their job is essentially, they've got to steer around that car to avoid being in a collision. That's generally pretty easy, but it does require perception, decision-making, and appropriate corrective action. All of those things we anticipate will be compromised in our marijuana patients. And then we draw their blood. We measure their marijuana concentration after the test. This is sort of the design. This is the simple road. I told you it was simple. Your job is to drive a car right down the middle of this road, 55 miles an hour, and it is really easy, and it's boring. But what we do occasionally, we pop a car right up in front of you. You're going 55 miles an hour, and out of nowhere a car comes, and your job is to steer around this way or steer around that way. And you can see that if you're stoned, you might not do quite so well. This is the kind of data that we get. we're early on now, so we don't have any conclusions, unfortunately. This is from our first subject, MMA 601. And basically what's shown here is the steering response is on the y-axis. And you can't see it, but each of these little numbers on the x-axis is 1/60th of 1 second. So what's plotted on that whole axis is about 1¼ seconds, going from, oh, it's actually 1 second, excuse me, going from 1 all the way out to interval 60, that's 1 whole second. The first quarter of that time, the first 15 samples, are before the car pops up in front of you. And you can see there's not a whole lot of steering required to go on a straight line on a simple road. When the car shows up, even a control subject is kind of slow in responding. Essentially, they have to see it, it has to register, they have to say, now I better turn, and they have to turn. And essentially, they spend about 400 milliseconds going through all of that, and then they make their turn. Our arbitrary cutoff, because this is a really nice, smooth function that accomplishes that term, our arbitrary cutoff is when someone has turned 10 degrees. That means that basically they're committed to sort of do an avoidance turn. And so in this subject, it took 29 intervals from the time the car appeared to the time they made that steering move. 29 intervals at 60 intervals per second gives them a response reaction time of 483 milliseconds. And so we measure that in addition to other measures, but we measure that in a group of control subjects, we measure that in our medical marijuana subjects and so forth. We've only recently started. If you want to be a subject, let me know. We're particularly interested in medical marijuana subjects, but we take controls as well. Maybe 6 months from now or so, we'll have some more interesting data, but that's where we are. So to wrap up the driving thing, we talked about some of these issues. And we talked about the legalization initiative first. We talked about some of the driving issues. I'd like to finish with one thing that was in the news recently. So Dr. Lysak mentioned that Canada had legalized throughout the country. And I think there are some unexpected consequences. No one would have predicted it, or maybe somebody would have, but I think a lot of people were surprised. But since they legalized only 1 week ago, this was one of the unexpected consequences. Tim Hortons in 7 provinces, 17 Tim Hortons operations were forced to close earlier than usual for lack of staff and the shortage of donuts. So there are unexpected consequences with legalization of marijuana. Or maybe they knew, I don't know. Thank you very much.